thank Professor Martyr for taking so deeply into two of Bernini's projects. The next talk is going to be a broader look at terracotta in Seicento, Rome, and different uses of models. We're very fortunate that Jennifer Montagu could join us today. She's admired by all scholars of Baroque art, a field to which she's made fundamental contributions. She did her PhD at the Warburg Institute at the University of London and spent most of her career in charge of the photograph collection there. She has published some of the most important monographs in the field of Italian Baroque sculpture, namely on Bernini's great rival, Alessandro Algardi, for which she wrote the fundamental monograph and was published in 1985, as well as an important exhibition on Algardi. She has also taken a wider view of the practice of the workshop and of sculptors in Rome in two very important publications, Roman Baroque Sculpture, The Industry of Art of 1989, and Gold, Silver, and Bronze Metal Sculpture of the Roman Baroque of 1996. Most recently, she's published Antonio Arrighi, a silversmith and bronze founder in Baroque Rome in 2009, and she's currently working on a book on the 18th century sculptor Giovanni Battista Maini and the sculpture of his time. In addition to these activities, she has been a trustee of the Wallace Collection and of the British Museum, as well as being on numerous committees, publication boards, and is really one of the most creative and important scholars in the field. Please welcome Jennifer Montagu.
Thank you, Ian, for those words, and thank you for inviting me here, giving me the opportunity to look at this really splendid exhibition. When I was asked for a title some months ago, I had somehow elaborated a distinction between modelli and models. By the time I came to write it, I could no longer remember what that was. So it's the briefer title I should be talking about. Think of McDonald's. I'm sure the first thing that will come to your mind is hamburgers, despite the fact that we all know that they produce a variety of other delicacies, some possibly even healthy. It's much the same with terracotta. Say the word and one thinks of sketches, Bozzetti, even though the material was used for many other purposes. And the current fascinating exhibition of Bernini's terracottas, being primarily of Bozzetti, although there are a few modelli also on show, will only reinforce such a tendency. My purpose here is to look at some of these various uses to which terracotta was put, and to indicate the difficulties that can arise in distinguishing between them. One use that I don't intend to dwell on is the creation of finished sculptures. Most of these would have been small. We know of sculptors of Bernini's time who made figures for Christmas cribs out of terracotta, and occasionally one encounters in Roman 17th century inventories small figures in terracotta, favored saints, or a small bust of a revered pope. Most surviving works of this kind are usually, and no doubt rightly, cast as Bolognese, and certainly the province of Emilia, and Bologna in particular, where there was no good statuary stone, has always specialized in the making of such figures. However, there seems no reason to doubt that it was sometimes used also in Rome, though plaster or papier-mâché were the preferred media for the production of small and relatively cheap figurines. While I need not remind you of the enameled clay sculpture made by the Della Robbia, or the terracotta, as well as plaster, was used in Tuscany to make innumerable reproductions of reliefs, usually representing the Virgin and Child. Again, in Emilia, larger sculptures had been, and in the Seicento still were, modeled in terracotta, such as the one on the left. However, one should remember that between 1632 and 3, at the time when Bernini was working on the baldacchino, and in fact, the precise time he was carving the statue of the Countess Matilda. Niccolo Mengini, the house sculptor of Cardinal Francesco Barberini, was making a terracotta image of the Transfiguration of Christ. This was large enough to require the making of a special kiln and destined to be painted and placed in, it seems, one of the Barberini estates outside Rome. But so far as I'm aware, such sculpture was fairly rare. So to sketches, such as the majority of the Bernini terracottas that I'm sure you have already admired in the exhibition. We all know what these look like. Sketchy. That's how we recognize them, no problem. So it rather chills the blood to read how in the mid-18th century, the young Donato Antonio Fantoni was making two terracotta models, one of his own invention and the other a copy after Camillo Rusconi. But both were merely sketched, solo in abbozzo. And these he had been instructed to make in order to learn how to give a free touch to the clay. Da I tocchi franchi. Could we, I wonder, be sure that we could distinguish Fantoni's copy from a sketch by Rusconi? Probably because the former was not a very distinguished sculptor, unlike the latter. But what if Fantoni had copied a work by a lesser figure, such as his friend Giovanni Grossi? Fantoni's models no longer exist, but we encounter just such a problem with the terracotta kneeling angel in Besançon on the left. I'm sorry, I didn't identify it. It's, well, you can work out which it is. This was formally accepted as yet another Bozzetto by Bernini for the altar of the sacrament in St. Peter's. But now the catalogue of the exhibition describes it as a copy by Luc-François Breton, and that seems far more plausible. He made a number of copies that are in that museum after famous sculptures in Rome. Copies do not have to be carefully finished models. Fortunately, the greater number of sketches can be safely attributed to the sculptors of the finished works, but these come in many different types. When Alessandro Algardi was to carve a huge relief of the meeting of Pope Leo the Great and Attila for an altar in St. Peter's, he began by making this rough sketch of the composition, admittedly in wax rather than clay. He must have made further studies of the whole before turning to individual figures, of which this terracotta of Attila survives, and possibly yet more before he was ready to make the full-sized plaster model. But no others are known today. A number of terracottas have been identified as his final model, but I believe that all of them are copies. There's one telltale detail. In the final full-scale sculpture, the dragon that winds around the standard. Sorry, I was pressing the wrong thing. I have to go back. One day I'll learn how to work out these things. The standard, which I can't hear, here, I think, in the model, in the full-size plaster, it curls around the staff in a sinuous movement that's typical of Algardi, but not typical of ancient Roman standards. Someone must have pointed this out to him, and in the marble, it's been changed to a more archaeologically correct, if less attractive, horizontal dragon. I don't believe that after making the full-size plaster, he would have made a terracotta of the whole altarpiece just to correct this one fairly minor detail. So any terracotta corresponding to the final marble with a straight dragon must be a copy of the finished work. Or we might look at Melchiorre Cafa's studies for the altarpiece of St. Eustace and his family not being eaten by lions, commissioned in 1660 for the Church of Sant'Agnese in Rome. Again, one terracotta model for the whole composition survives, which is quite far from the marble, which he began even though the altarpiece was finished after his untimely death by Ercole Ferrata. He must certainly have made other composition studies, but what we have are a number of sketches for individual figures or groups of figures, gradually progressing towards their final form. Not everyone accepts them all, but I do, and I believe that he did visualize and perhaps even model the entire scene, and then worked on individual figures within it, before perhaps returning to reconsider the altarpiece as a whole. In any case, at least this fragment here is of what may have been a larger composition, is entirely in Cafa's manner and would seem undeniably his. This method of making sketches of individual parts of a larger composition seemed to have been fairly common. But as you will have seen among Bernini's terracotta studies for the St. Jerome in Siena, a sculptor might also concentrate on a part of a figure, most usually the head, just as a painter would make drawings or painted sketches of parts of figures before beginning to paint on his canvas, or produce more carefully worked up final drawings for transfer of important details for large frescoes, what are known as auxiliary cartoons. This fine terracotta head has been attributed to Bernini, but does not relate to any known figure by him. Recently, Tony Siegel has noted that it has a pointing mark, subsequently hidden by a piece of clay representing hair, just there, which means that the image would have been transferred to marble, which makes it even less likely that it could be by Bernini, since we know no marbles with this head. However, it corresponds exactly to the head of one of the angels carved by Antonio Giorgetti to support the balustrade of the chapel of the Spada Chapel in San Girolamo della Carità in Rome. It would seem perverse to try to claim that it is by anyone other than Giorgetti. 2 terracotta studies are known for the whole figure, though one is broken, and most likely the sculptor made a full-scale plaster before attacking the marble. Whether or not he did, he clearly wanted a more detailed study before working on the face and modeled this terracotta, leaving the less important bits, such as the hair, merely in relatively unworked masses, which nonetheless correspond to those of the marble. This fact is important. The head is illustrated in the catalogue of the Bernini exhibition, and there it's implied that it might yet be a work by Bernini, reused by Giorgetti for his angel. Indeed, as we shall see, such things did happen. However, in this case, there's nothing but its quality to justify Bernini's authorship, and it would be wholly mistaken to believe that only Bernini could create a fine terracotta. In this case, the whole face, and in particular the hair, matches the Spada angel, and this hair is totally different from that on the couple of heads by Bernini with which it has been associated in the past, the Proserpina, which has a completely different expression, or the Santa Bibiana, where the expression is rather closer, but the hair is not. It's by this relationship to known works, usually in marble, that most Bozzetti are attributed. But this method can have its dangers, for a sculptor might well ask for models from his assistants. We read of how Algardi tried to prevent his assistant, Giuseppe Perrone, from sloping off after some woman by telling him to stay in the studio and make models that he needed. This didn't work. Algardi himself went off after his own woman, and once he'd left, Perrone followed his example. In this case, Perrone was not a particularly good sculptor, so we might assume that it was a molding, or at best some decorative detail, that he was to supply. In other cases, it could well be that a talented assistant would provide a worked-up model from the master's sketch. However, Ercole Ferrata was said by his friend and biographer to be lacking in invention, and to have not infrequently asked his more inspired assistants to make models for him, which he would then elaborate into the final work. Undoubtedly, his most gifted assistant in this respect was Melchiorre Cafa, and I'm convinced that it was this Maltese sculptor who made the terracotta from which Ferrata modeled the stucco figure of Silence in Santa Maria in Vallicella. The terracotta has a fluidity that is lacking in the certain terracottas by Ferrata, and other details of the modeling are typical of Cafa. At least in this case, there's only one known model. But for Ferrata's best-known statue, the figure of Faith on the tomb of Lelio Falconieri in San Giovanni dei Fiorentini in Rome, probably commissioned in 1665, no less than 7 are known, and new ones seem to pop up every few years. The latest, this one here, was published by Andrea Bacchi with an attempt to sort out the status of the others, an attempt with which I'm in general agreement and which I'm following here. Again, I believe that the first was made by Cafa. This one here. Not only is it the furthest from the final marble, but the modeling differs from all the subsequent versions, and this now seems to be generally accepted. The latest version, this one here, is of a very high quality and close to other terracottas accepted as by the master, such as the St. Petersburg Angel with the Cross, which is illustrated in the catalogue. Those in the bottom row, in Toledo, the Palazzo Venezia in Rome with its upright putto, and in a private collection, are relatively heavy in their modeling. Moreover, 2 show the head of the prelate in a less frontal pose, as in the marble, whereas both the Cafa version and the new one show him in strict medallic profile. Although the Toledo version does show him in profile, looking rather like St. Charles Borromeo, the modeling lacks the quality one would expect of Ferrata. This leaves the 2 in the middle row, in Hamburg and the Palazzo Barberini. Bacchi accepts them, while admitting some inadequacies in the latter, as showing Ferrata refining his ideas. I admit I'm rather less sure. For me, the question remains open as to whether one should accept them as by the master like the 2 above, or regard them as copies like the 3 below. As for these last 3, accepting that they are copies, one could argue interminably as to where they were made, by assistants in Ferrata's studio, or by unrelated sculptors impressed by the beauty of the marble. Copies are a despised class of terracotta. If a museum can be convinced that their terracotta is a copy, and this can be a difficult task, it will sometimes be removed from exhibition. But by no means all copies are despicable, and many have interesting origins. There's one class of copies about which we know little or nothing, except that they must have been made. To produce a replica in metal, whether in bronze or in silver, one must begin with a model, almost invariably in clay. If the story that Bernini, in disgrace at the court of Innocent X, won the commission for the fountain in the Piazza Navona by making a model in silver, thus ensuring the support of Olympia Maidalchini, the Pope's sister-in-law renowned for her cupidity, then he too, when all his competitors presented mere drawings or models in clay, then he too must have started with a clay model from which the molds and silver would be cast. If, as I say, this story is true, we can't even be certain what it would have looked like, and whether all the numerous studies that he made for this important work preceded the commission, or did not follow it, as he struggled to perfect his initial ideas. He might have used these models here, or perhaps they're even finished though they are, they're not sufficiently finished to make bronzes, so he may have used separate ones when he came to make silver statuettes after these marbles in 1664 to be sent to Louis XIV in France, which we know he made 4 figures of the rivers from the Four River Fountain, without apparently a fountain to support them. He also sent him rather larger copies of his marble figures of Apollo and Daphne, David, Neptune with the Triton but without the Triton, and the Rape of Proserpina. Unlike the 4 rivers, these appear in the French royal inventories. They were made by Bernini, just possibly for the fountain, and if just possibly for the fountain figures, he could have used the Modelli now in Venice. But it's likely that he would have wanted even more finished versions, and if so, it's highly improbable that he made them himself. Such a task would certainly have been handed to an assistant. even if Bernini supervised the work. Although these other 4 marbles that he reproduced in silver had been autograph works, they were all rather earlier, so it seems unlikely he would have retained finished models, and certainly none of them survive today. We don't have any evidence concerning his involvement with another silver replica in the collection of Louis XIV, the Fountain of the Moor. These silver reductions have all long since disappeared, nor can we be sure that any of the surviving bronze replicas, of which there are many, correspond to the silver reductions made for the King of France, though there are bronze replicas of the Neptune with the trident, even if all that I know include a dolphin not mentioned in the French Royal Inventory. There are many other bronze reductions of Bernini's sculptures. For instance, a fine bronze of the Blessed Ludovica Albertone. I'm afraid I had only a rather bad photo, but it is a good quality bronze. And I show you also a bronze variant of the model, which, by the addition of a martyr's palm and her attribute of a censer, has been converted into the Santa Palazia, venerated in Ancona for a reliquary casket. In looking at terracottas that are clearly copies, we should bear in mind the creation of such metal replicas. Nor was metal the only material used for making copies. Whoever the sculptor was who carved this superannuated version of the Ludovica Albertone to represent St. Anne beneath her altar in Sant'Andrea delle Frate, certainly it was not Maini as the church believes, may have relied on a drawing, even apart from the head, it's a fairly free rendering of Bernini's original. However, one can't rule out the possibility that he too might have felt it necessary to make a clay copy to work from. Many copies will have been made by students or even amateurs. I've already mentioned Fantoni making copies for his own education, and this sculptor from Bergamo wrote of making many others of famous statues to take back to his hometown for future use, just as did Breton in the case of the Kneeling Angel and others figures. Just as aspiring painters and sculptors made drawings of earlier works as a method of training, so apprentice sculptors would make models of earlier statues. We know that Ercole Ferrata, who had what was certainly the most flourishing studio in Rome during the third quarter of the 17th century, sent his students to copy not only whole figures, but details of hands and so forth. Those of the young Camillo Rusconi were so expertly done that casts were made for the assistance of other students in other workshops. Undoubtedly, many of the unattributed terracottas so abundant in Ferrata's post-mortem inventory would have been such works. Later, the younger students of the Academy of St. Luke in Rome had an annual prize for a copy of some statue, most often an antique, but also sometimes a more modern work, and at least on 2 occasions, it was a marble by Bernini, the Charity and Truth on the tomb of Alexander VII, or the Santa Bibiana. It's highly unlikely that any such copies remain, though maybe we should remember them when looking at obvious later terracotta reductions of such works. I should like to end by considering 2 terracotta heads related to the angel in Algardi's statue of St. Philip Neri. I should say that I have already done so in the past, always reaching the same conclusion, but always remaining slightly worried. Now I'm submitting the problem to you. One in Hamburg is unquestionably an object of great beauty. The other is known only from a photograph in the catalogue of the 1897 sale of the Comte de Choiseul. It's now lost, but had on its back a label with the initials PBC, and was therefore said to come from the public collection of Bologna. It's supported on the base by goat heads, which one might like to think are connected with the arms of the Zambeccari, a Bolognese family that had patronized Algardi and owned at least a crucifix by him. The Hamburg head is of strikingly different proportions to the marble, shorter and broader. This characteristic is also rather typical of Algardi, often increased, as here, by widely flowing hair. This works perfectly well when seen at eye level, but seen from below, like the marble, These aspects would become more apparent through foreshortening. Algardi was notoriously lacking in the ability to visualize his works in the context in which they would eventually appear, or the angle from which they would be seen. And time and again, as one watches the development of a model, one sees him adapting his first idea to take account of this. So, I have argued, he would have modeled this head to study an important part of the group and then modified it to improve its appearance from below. These corrections are seen in the Choiseul head. Lacking the original, it's hard to be sure just how closely the modeling of the face corresponds to the marble, though the mouth doesn't appear to be open as it is in the final version, and the locks of the hair are much more broadly modeled, apart from the fact that they have the sketchy quality one tends to associate with the Bozzetto rather than a copy. However, as we have seen, sketchiness is no proof that we are not dealing with a copy. Such a scenario seems to me to make perfect sense, yet one could argue against it. The carefully defined cut-off of the Hamburg head, is not something one expects in a preliminary model. Clearly, it was intended to stand as a self-sufficient bust. Could a copyist have made the adjustments and the proportions when modeling a bust to stand at eye level? I think not. It seems far more likely that having modeled the head and recognized its beauty, Algardi realized that it could serve, and possibly be sold for good money, as an independent work of art. And indeed, as an image of masculine beauty, it seems to have taken on a new life, identified as a head of Apollo, the name under which the terracotta was sold in the last century, and under which it was reproduced in Doccia porcelain. But what of the Choiseul head? It comes very close to the marble, and the broad expanse of the shoulders is far greater than the nude area of the marble angel, which could suggest that it was a study after rather than a study for the marble. However, apart from the closed mouth, the locks of the hair are far less differentiated and separated than in the marble, while, despite their free modeling, they are carefully formed, which would seem a strange anomaly in a copy. Assuming that Algardi felt the need to make a separate finished study for the head of the angel and was responsible for the terracotta in Hamburg, it's entirely reasonable to suppose that, having recognized its deficiencies, he would have made another. Until the reappearance of the Choiseul head permits a proper assessment of its quality, I remain prepared to give it the benefit of the doubt. Whether or not you agree with my generosity, what is beyond doubt is the popularity of this model. We've looked at the angel Giorgetti carved for the balustrade in the Spada Chapel, and I mentioned the suggestion in the catalogue that he might have borrowed a model by Bernini. Behind this suggestion lies a fascinating discovery by Anne Sutherland Harris of a note on the back of a drawing by the painter Giovanni Francesco Grimaldi that he had loaned Giorgetti some books and The Head of the Angel by Algardi. Grimaldi was a very close friend of Algardi, so he might well have owned a head by him. This note is not dated, but it must surely have been when Giorgetti was carving the model head of the angel on the iconostasis at Grottaferrata. Though without climbing up close to it, it's hard to be certain whether it was the Hamburg or the Choiseul model that he borrowed. It was the Choiseul model that was cast in a bronze acquired in the 18th century by Cardinal Giovanni Maria Riminaldi for the museum that he created in Ferrara. And in 1779, this was described as representing the famous angel of Algardi. The hair has been neatly combed, or rather chiseled, but the locks are still the heavier ones of the terracotta, and an exiguous drapery has been added round the shoulders. In view of this fame, it's strange that only this one bronze cast is known today. Rather than show you any of the many other replicas from the 17th or 18th centuries, I shall end with a copy of the Hamburg terracotta, which has lost none of its appeal today. This is a poster I snapped on the opposite side of an underground station in 1997. I don't know why they reversed obviously they reversed the photo that they used, but it shows how this head was regarded as an ideal way to decorate your home today. Thank you.